I'm so excited about this class. I had to wake up this morning saying, calm down, calm down. Whew, take a deep breath. We've been waiting a long time to study Revelation, and it is such a great book. And so I'm looking forward to sharing this message with you. Before we get into too much, Chase is going to lead a prayer at the end. But is there anything that we need to be praying about that's come up in the last few days? No, it's kind of normal days. All right. Nothing unique. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I know she prayed for that Sunday. I appreciate that. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, let's get into it. I have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. It's Revelation is a book that, if we're quite honest, we have just pretty much ignored in the Brotherhood. We've just let denominational or liberal scholars just kind of print whatever they want about the book and say whatever they want. And we just have kind of approached it like, well, okay, well, we've got our books and you got yours. But if you'll check, I believe Revelation is in our Bible. Just check, but I think it's there. I believe that's our book. And it's one that we need to know. Now, granted, the average modern day Bible student cannot pick up the book of Revelation, read it through, and totally understand it without some preparation. I think we realize that. I'm not going to say it's a simple book, because it's not. It takes some preparation. But it's probably not as hard as you think it is if you have two things. One is you need a basic understanding of apocalyptic literature, and I'm going to teach you that. It won't take much. It's not another language necessarily. It's just some nuances, some unique things about the way that apocalyptic literature is worded. The second thing that you really have to have is at least a basic knowledge of the Old Testament. And so if you don't have that, you won't get most of the things that are going on in Revelation. So I'll help you with the first one. You got to help yourself with the second one, all right? You need to read the Old Testament. You really do, so you can understand it. And I told you before, especially if you'll read Ezekiel and Daniel, those two books in particular will help you in your understanding of Revelation. It is well worth investing the time, and it is such a pity that we have not studied it as much as we've studied other books, because the book of Revelation, what it really boils down to is God saying, I know you're concerned. I know that you are being persecuted, church, but I love you, and I'm going to make all the wrongs right in the end. And so be patient. And tell me that's not a message that we need today. No, it is something that's going to be very practical, but you're going to need to invest some time, and I know you will. I know that I've got some very dedicated students in here. I know you want to learn, and so I'm going to give you some assignments. One is read the book of Revelation. When I took the Revelation as a course, we had to, because it was for grade, but we had to read it every week. And it didn't matter if we read a few chapters a day, because there's 22 chapters, or read it all at one setting. It didn't matter, just as long as we read it every week. I would recommend you do that. For as long as we're teaching this class, once a week, read through the book of Revelation. And as we learn more, obviously it's going to make more and more sense to you. So that is a good habit for you to get into. Another thing that will help you is in my book, and let me say from the very beginning, you don't have to have my book to take the class, but a lot of you have it already, and you know there's a table of contents right there that has the chapter names. The reason these are worded the way they are, like chapter 1 is Patmos Island, chapter 2 is the first 4 churches, chapter 3 is the next 3 churches. If you will learn those, it will help you to quickly figure out where you need to turn in the book if you're studying with a friend, or if you're talking to a relative and they have questions about, I have some questions about the 144,000. You know, that's chapter 7. You'll have that down if you will learn those. And I'll probably next week go ahead and print that off. I have it on my notes so that you can have that without having to have the book. You probably also notice that there's 3-hole punch in your notes. And I've already been asked, when do we get the notebook? Well, if you're really good, maybe next week or the week after, okay? But before you get a thick stack, I'll get you a notebook so you can keep it all together, and even a little cover page for you so that it doesn't tear your pages when you put it in the notebook. If you have been listening to the radio, if you've been watching TV, if you have been taught that Revelation is about barcodes stamped on your hand or on your forehead, or if it's about AH-1Z Viper helicopters and 200 million screaming Chinese soldiers and the rapture and all sorts of things like that, this is going to be a real shocker of a class for you, because it's not about any of that stuff. There's lots of bizarre conjecture that people have tried to extrapolate from this wonderful book, and we're going to clear the air of all that. I'm going to show you how to help people understand that's not what Revelation is really about. We're going to understand it in its historical setting. We're going to know how it applied to the people it was written to, so that we know how it applies to us. The book opens, and if you'll turn to Revelation chapter 1, the book opens with a blessing for those who will read and understand the book. Revelation chapter 1. Revelation 1 and verse 3. Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of the prophecy and heed the things which are written in it, for the time is near. So the book opens with a blessing for those who will read and those who will hear. Keep in mind, this letter is being sent to the 7 churches of Asia Minor: Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. You can look those up. They're all in Asia Minor, and that's a circle that goes clockwise to each of those churches, and it was circulated and read to each one of them. It was read to them because most of them could not read. And so the blessing is for those who read and those who hear. Somebody would be reading it, everybody else would be hearing it. There's a blessing for those who will take the time to understand the book of Revelation. But the book closes, turn to chapter 22. The book closes with a curse. Revelation chapter 22, starting in verse 18. I testify to everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of the book. If anyone adds to them, God will add to him the plagues which are written in this book. And if anyone takes away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God will take away his part from the tree of life and from the holy city which are written in this book. So it starts with a blessing, but it ends with a warning. Don't you dare add something to this book. Don't you dare take something away from this book. So remember the blessing and remember the curse. We want to approach this book with expectancy, but also with sobriety. Do not be frivolous in your understanding, in your learning, and in your eventual teaching of the book of Revelation. I hope all of you are here learning so that you will be teachers. God is opposed to those who teach the Word of God incorrectly, but he blesses truth seekers. So we want to be truth seekers. All right, let's get into the human author and the dating of the book of Revelation. First of all, the author is John. He identifies himself in the very first verse. He says his name again in verse 4 of chapter 1. He says it again in verse 9 of chapter 1. And then he says it at the end in chapter 22 and verse 8. He says, this is John. I, John, write to you. Now, John was a very common name back then, just as it is today. And for a man to identify himself by that one name, John, and for us to know who it was, it had to be a pretty popular John, right? The two most popular Johns in the Bible are John the Apostle and John the Baptizer. I'll give you a hint. John the Baptizer didn't write it, okay? We'll narrow it down quickly. This is John the Apostle. This is John the Apostle, who is the one whom was at one time a follower of John the Baptizer. He had a brother named James. James and John were known as Boanerges. Does anybody know what Boanerges means? Sons of thunder. Okay? That's because they were the ones that when Jesus went to a place and they didn't accept the word, they said, do you want us to just call down thunder on this place and just destroy it? So they got the reputation of being Boanerges. That's interesting because John later became known as the Apostle of Love. He changed quite a bit. His father's name was Zebedee. His mother was Salome. We get indications from several places in the Gospel of John that he was closer to Jesus than the other apostles. He's referred to as the one whom Jesus loved. There are, of course, critics that say John didn't write the Revelation. No surprise there. They criticize every book of the Bible, right? It's interesting that there's very little criticism or disagreement about John writing the Gospel, or that John wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. He didn't sign any of those 4 books. He signs this one 4 times and say, no, he didn't write that one. But he did. It is very different than John or 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. It's different because the circumstances were totally different. If you go back to chapter 1 and look at the first verse with me, it starts off the revelation. The word "the" is not there in the Greek. Revelation is the first word in the Greek language. Apocalypsis, where we get our word apocalyptic. Something that is revealed, something that is made known. The revelation of who? Jesus Christ. So who are these words really from? Jesus. We often say that Jesus didn't write any of the books of the Bible, and technically that's true. But he dictated this letter to John. And this is the closest thing we have to a message directly from Jesus Christ. So have you ever thought, man, if Jesus wrote a book, I would definitely read that. Well, then you definitely need to read Revelation, because this is definitely from Jesus. but he's dictating it to John, so the writing style is going to be different. He's hearing it, he's watching, and he's writing down what he sees. Whereas the Gospel of John and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, he's writing as a Holy Spirit guided man, but he's writing down his thoughts, basically, as controlled or as guided by the Holy Spirit. But this is a different scenario, and so that's why the writing style is different, but the same author. So John wrote this. Let's get into the dating of the book. This is probably the most controversial thing we'll study in the whole book of Revelation, is how you date the book. There's a lot of different ideas out there about how to date the book. I use the book to date the book. Let me show you what I mean. Look at Revelation chapter 17. Revelation chapter 17, starting in verse 9. Here's the mind which has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits, and they are 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is. The other has not yet come, and when he comes, he must remain a little while. The beast, which was and is not, is himself also an 8th king, and is one of the 7, and he goes to destruction. And then he goes on to talk more about the 10 horns. The beast we will be studying obviously later when we get to this chapter. The woman and the beast with 7 heads, he clarifies in verse 9, the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. I'm going to show you that this is talking about Rome when we get there. For now, take my word for it, and if I'm wrong, we'll find out later. But Rome is the city on 7 hills. It's famous for being that. And he says very clearly that the 7 mountains and the 7 heads are one and the same. He also says the 7 heads are 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and 1 is yet to come. You got that? 5 have fallen, 1 is, and 1 is yet to come. Now look at your notes. And I have there a list of the first kings of the Roman Empire. Now let me point out that Julius Caesar is not on that list. And the reason is he was never a king. You see, when the Roman Empire started out, it started out to get away from monarchy. And that's why it was governed by a senate, and there was never going to be a king. Well, that didn't last very long. It lasted through Julius Caesar, and then they got to Augustus, and he set himself up as the king. And so he was really the first king. He reigned for 41 years. The dates are there in your notes. 27 BC to 14 AD. And then after him, Tiberius reigned from 14 AD to 37 AD. So who was the king of Rome when Jesus walked the earth? Tiberius. So next was Gaius. He reigned from 37 AD to 41 AD, just 4 years there. Then the 4th king was Claudius, 41 to 54 AD. The next one is the famous Nero, who reigned from 54 to 68 AD. How did Nero die? Anybody know? How did Nero die? Suicide. Slit his throat. After he said, what a showman the world is losing in me, or something, like that. And then he killed himself. Nero was not a good man, as most of you know. Well, none of these guys really were great people, but Nero was horrible. And he had nearly destroyed Rome with his politics and with his leading and with his paranoia. And so when he died, there was civil war. There were 3 usurpers that rose up to try to take control of Rome. They are not considered as kings for the most part because they weren't even in office long enough to get the name changed over the door. Okay, it was in and out quick, right? Another guy, Vespasian, he sat back and he watched these three kind of duke it out. This one beat that one, and that one beat that one, and then he just took on the winner, and that's how Vespasian got to be the king. Vespasian was the sixth king. He reigned from 69 to 79 AD. After that, his son Titus reigned 79 to 81 AD. He would have been the seventh king, and then Vespasian had another king, Domitian. We'll be learning a lot about him during our study of Revelation. He is the eighth king. So, as the book is being written, he says, 5 have fallen, 1 is, and 1 is yet to come. Now, if our secular dating is correct, and I understand we're relying on secular dating, which doesn't mean it's wrong, it just means it's not God-inspired. Who was the reigning king when the book of Revelation was written? Vespasian. Okay? Now, there are critics of that who say, nope, that's not true. It was written much, much later. If you just Google search when was Revelation written, you will see, I think I saw one was 110 AD or something like that. I mean, there's some way, way out there dates. Some believe that the book was written when Domitian was reigning, and the proofs that they use for that is not the Bible, like I just used, but secular writings of patriarchal fathers who talked about Domitian being the one who exiled John to Patmos. Even if that were true, and again, that's secular writing, that's not inspired scripture. Domitian, if Vespasian was his dad, what would that make Domitian? Makes him a prince, right? Would a prince have authority to exile somebody to prison? Sure, yeah. And so just the fact that writing says that Vespasian did that does not prove that, that Domitian exiled John, doesn't prove that it happened during his reign. It could have happened during Vespasian's reign. There's a lot of controversy about that. Why is it important? What difference does it make? You know, I have a colleague who also wrote a book on Revelation, and in his book he says it doesn't matter what the date is. I disagree. I think it does matter for two reasons. One is it definitely matters to those who take the preterist view, and I'll explain what the preterist view is here in a moment, but that's basically the belief that Revelation is about the destruction of Jerusalem, which occurred in AD 70. Therefore, they have to have an early date, or Revelation is prophesying things that already happened. But the second and the biggest reason why the date makes a difference is, I don't know of a scholar that doesn't agree Revelation was the last book written. And if it's the last one written, that means all the others were written before that. And so every date of a New Testament book that is after the reign of Vespasian would be fallible. And you can do a Google search on when was the Gospel of Matthew written, and you will find anything from 80 to 95 AD. Which of course, I think that's wrong. But that's where the dating of the book of Revelation becomes important. If it is the last book, and if it was written during the reign of Vespasian, then all the other books of the New Testament were written prior to that. Okay? When was it written between 69 and 79 AD? Don't know that one. I picked 78 AD because I graduated in 78 and I just like that year, all right? So that's my favorite, but it was somewhere in there according to Revelation chapter 17. Okay, enough on that. Yes? His his son, yeah, Domitian. Yes, yes, yeah. And Emperor de facto means that he acted in the place of his father, who was the emperor at that time. Yes, yeah, yeah, yeah. It is fascinating that that wouldn't be. Yeah, yeah. Of course, it wasn't written to Jerusalem. It was written to Asia Minor. But you're right. That is a pretty significant event to not be mentioned in the book. Okay. Good comment. Anybody else have a comment? All right. Appreciate that. Let's get into the different views of the book of Revelation. There are four basic views, and obviously there's multiple subcategories of all of this. But let me give you the four basic views of the book of Revelation. The first one is the futurist view. This is a very popular view. This is the belief that the book of Revelation is a forecast of events just prior to the end of the world. All this is going to happen. This is the way it's going to happen. Proponents of this view look for signs current in world events, and they cross-reference the book of Revelation with the evening news and kind of see what they come up with. How many of you watched the movie Left Behind? Maybe seen that or read the books? There's a book series, very popular. That's the view that this is based on. If you've heard people talk about Jesus returning for 1,000 years, Kathy and I were watching a movie just last night, and the guy says, we've got to get ready because the Lord is returning to this earth and he's going to reign for 1,000 years. No, he's not. Okay, but that is the futurist view, and that is a very popular view. The continual historical method of interpretation is not quite as popular, but this is the view that Revelation is an unfolding of events from the time of the first century church up to today's time. So in other words, each of the seals that's being opened represents a period of time. And when the seventh seal is open, then the trumpets are sounded. And each of the seven trumpets represents another period of time. And when the seventh trumpet is sounded, then the seven bowls are poured out, and each of those represents a period of time. Everybody that I know of that holds this view believes that we're living in the time of the sixth bowl. So there's waiting on that seventh one, and then it's over. So that is another view. The preterist view, which I mentioned earlier, preterist comes from the Latin word for past. This is the view that Revelation is actually a warning to God's people about the destruction of Jerusalem, and that is coming, and that they need to get ready for that event. And we'll say more about that later on. Okay. Hang on a second. Lost my place in my notes here. How did I do that? Not that one. Okay. The next one. How did I word it? Historical background, prophetic principle. All right. This is the view that I hold. It is the view that in order to understand the book of Revelation, we have to understand it in its historical context, learn its historical background. It was written to that people. And then after we learn how it applied to them, then we can see how it applies to us. But to jump that first step and say, all this is just talking about our time, it had nothing to do with those back then, as I'm going to show you throughout the book, that view just does not hold water. All right. Was there anything else on your notes that I missed? Because your notes are not the same as mine. You have 2 pages, I have 6. So did I cover everything on your notes? Good. All right. All right. Any questions on introductory material? Okay, let's get into the numbering. Is that not on your notes? All right. Apocalyptic literature. This is another thing that would be good for you to memorize, maybe not word for word, but at least to the point that when you see a number, you understand basically what it means. So, number 1, and again, I'm going, oh wait, I got this. I forgot. I got it right here. Number 1 is the number for unity. And this number really is not used in the book of Revelation. It's used in several places in Ezekiel. Now, the word 1 appears 14 times in Revelation, but with the exception of maybe chapter 21 and verse 21, it's really not being used in an apocalyptic way necessarily. It just means 1. Number 2 is the number for strength. Ecclesiastes chapter 4 talks about where 2 are better than 1. Remember that passage? And so 2 is a number for strength. If you can't get the lid off the jar, sometimes you put 2 hands on there and it'll come off easier. So that's a good way to remember. 2 is a number for strength. We'll see this in Revelation chapter 11 and verse 3. 3 is the number for God. And we think, well, that's because Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right? The Trinity. No. The Hindus, in their apocalyptic literature, use 3 as the number for God. And how many gods do they have? Myriads. They have lots of gods. So it's not necessarily Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's just 3 represents God. Now, some of these, you're going to say, well, why? I don't know why. It's just this is how it's used. And when you study apocalyptic literature, when that number comes about, when we see 3, if you only think about the numerical value, you're going to miss the meaning of the book. You need to think God. That's what the number 3 represents, is God. 4 is the number for the world. And again, I don't know why. I can speculate. There's 4 directions, north, south, east, and west. Okay, there's 4 seasons. Maybe that's what it is. But 4 in apocalyptic literature came to be the number for the world, the physical world that we're part of. 5 is the number for human completeness. So if something is like 5 months, that's a humanly complete period of time. If it's 5 years, that's a humanly complete period of time. If it's 5 seconds, that's a humanly complete period of time. And maybe it's because if you got all 5 fingers, then you're complete. You got them all. I don't know. But that's the number for human completeness, not godly completeness, human completeness. 3.5. 3.5 is the number for unfinished. It's half of 7, which is the perfect number, the most popular number in Revelation. And 3.5 is stated several different ways. 3.5 years is 42 months. So we may see 42 months in Revelation. In fact, we will. And there it means 3.5 years, which is not a literal amount of time. It means an incomplete period of time. Or it's also 1,260 days, which is 3.5 years. And I should probably explain, back in those days, a year was 360 days, not 365 like we use now. So it's 360. Every once in a while they threw in another month to kind of balance it out, but they went with 360 days. We'll also see the expression time, times, and a half a time. Times means 2. Time is 1, and then a half in time is how much? 3.5. This is a half here. Okay. All right, that's a half. So times time and a half a time is 3.5. So if you see that expression, it means what? An incomplete period of time. All right. All right. 4, number of the world. 5. 6. 6 is man's number. It's the number for mortality. It's 7 is God's number, so it's falling short of God. Anytime you see 6, that is man's number. 7 is the number for perfection. I already mentioned that. It is by far the most popular number in Revelation, and we'll talk about it over and over again. 8 is a number for new beginnings. I have in your notes here, the 8th day begins a new week. 8 people survived the flood. Circumcision was done on the 8th day. Maybe that's the reasons. But 8 means new beginnings. 8 is not, it really doesn't come into play in the book of Revelation, but just so you know what that number is. 9 is the number for judgment. In the book of Haggai, he prophesies a 9-fold judgment on Israel. Jesus died at the 9th hour. 9 is the number for judgment. That will come into play in the book of Revelation. 10 is the number for human completeness. You say, well, we already covered that. Yeah, I know we did. 5 is the number for human completeness, and so is 10. So anytime you see those, that is human completeness. Now, 1,000 is 10 times 10 times 10, right? And so that is human completeness to the nth degree, to the extreme. So anytime we see 1,000, like 1,000-year reign, it's not a literal number. It means human to the nth degree. All right? 12 is the number for God's kingdom on earth. And I might point out here before we get to certain passages, that is not necessarily just New Testament. That could be talking about Old Testament kingdom on earth. In other words, the Israelite nation. But 12 means God's people on earth. How many patriarchs were there in the Old Testament? 12. How many tribes of Israel? 12. Okay. How many apostles in the New Testament? 12. It's God's people on earth, not in heaven. On earth. Got it? If you could learn these, if you could memorize them, that would be great. At least learn them well enough that when we come across these numbers, your mind gets to where you plug this in. If you can learn how to do that, you can pick up the book of Revelation once you learn apocalyptic language and learn the Old Testament. You can read through it just like any other book. Our first century brethren could have this book read to them, and they got it. Why? Because they understood apocalyptic language. They knew what it meant. They also knew the Old Testament. That's what they grew up with. And so that's why they could understand it. It's picture language. And so rather than, one of the big criticisms of Revelation is, well, if that's what it meant, why didn't he just come out and say that? Why didn't he just say human completeness? Why stick a number in there? The way Revelation is written, it's pictures. It's not words. There's a scene. A seal is broken, and out comes a horse, and it's white, right? And the color means something. There's going to be 4 horses. Well, that means something. And so the colors mean things. But once you learn that, it was easier for first century brethren to memorize that and to keep it in their minds because they could see the picture. We do the same thing today. We just don't think about it. If you saw in the newspaper a donkey swinging an elephant around by the tail, what would you think? They're having a rebellion down at the zoo. No, you wouldn't. You know what that means, don't you? Okay, it means the Democrats beating the Republicans. Okay, we understand that. But imagine 2,000 years from now, somebody finding that paper and thinking, what in the world is that? They wouldn't get it unless they learned, right? Well, that's what we're doing. We're learning how it applied to them so that we can understand it. Right. Any questions about that? The colors mean things. There are certain symbols we're going to learn about. Dragons, horses. Horses in the book of Revelation only meant one thing. Anybody know? War. The commoner did not ride horses around. All right? They rode donkeys, burros. If you rode a horse, you were a soldier. So whenever you see horses, that means war. Dragons, we'll get to that. We'll explain that. The colors, some of them you'll be able to know. What do you think white stands for? Purity, yeah. That's exactly right. Okay. Red. Violence, bloodshed. Okay. Black. Evil, darkness, yeah. Okay. So some of these will be obvious. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. He's just babbling. Yeah. 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 Mhm. Yes. Yeah. I'm glad you said that because it wasn't just written to Jews. The 7 churches of Asia Minor, there would have been some Jews dispersed in Asia Minor, but there were Jews and Gentiles in those 7 churches. So, yeah, and they would have understood what it meant. But you're right. Unless somebody invested the time, they wouldn't get it. They wouldn't understand it. Now they could learn it just like we're learning it now. But for the most part, maybe that's why it was written in apocalyptic language. We don't really know for sure why. It just is. And so if we want to learn it, we've got to learn apocalyptic language. It's really not that hard, folks. I hope you're not discouraged already. It is going to take a little bit of investment. And, I'll be honest with you, I did not study Revelation when I first became a Christian. And when I first started preaching, I didn't know anything really about Revelation. I just had accepted, here's what the Brotherhood believes about it. Okay, that's what I believe. I'd never really studied it out and owned it for myself. I even said one time from the pulpit, and I'm so ashamed of this, I said, I'm glad Revelation is in the back of the Bible because that's the last book I'm ever going to study. I said that, honest, I did. And I am so embarrassed about that because it is such a great book and so much wonderful things for us to learn. I want you to read the book of Revelation this week, if you would. We will start with chapter 1 next week. Do I have any other questions before we, yeah. Well, yeah, there's some. As far as the reasoning why, yeah, Matthew 13, is that what you're thinking? Where he was asked why? I don't know if you could hear Raymond's question. He's wondering if there a parallel between Jesus using apocalyptic literature and the reason he spoke in parables. And the reason Raymond's asking that is because in Matthew 13, when the apostles ask him, why do you speak in parables? He says, I'm speaking this way because some are hearing but they don't understand, whereas those who really want to know will seek it out and they'll get the knowledge and it'll benefit them. Jesus used parables in his teaching so that the Pharisees and the scribes dispersed in his audience would get nothing really out of the message to use against him. But his own disciples would find out what the parable meant and get the spiritual meaning behind it, and so it benefited. It was really genius. Jesus was the master teacher. It was a genius way to teach. Also, the parables were easier to remember. For people who were basically uneducated, they could hear a parable and it would stick with them. They may not understand the deep spiritual concept, but they could understand a farmer sowing his seed. They got that. And so he put it on a simple level so they could get it. There may have been something to that. Okay. Anybody else? Good questions, good comments. Yes, Leola? Yes. Yes. The book of Revelation does not necessarily teach how to become a Christian. It does talk about evangelism and about sharing our faith quite a bit. But no, it adds to the books that we already have. But the reason we study Revelation is we need its encouragement. It's a book written to persecuted people, and it's of great benefit. And when you and I are studying with people, if you can understand the books, the basics of the book, and they come up with something just off the wall, well, really it's about this. If you could talk intelligently about that and say, actually, let's look at that passage. That's over here. Let's look at that together. Man, think about the benefit that you could be to lost people if we'll just take the time to learn the book.